I have a question before we have one from online, but is there any evidence that different age groups are becoming, as a consequence of this, rush of change with COVID, etc., more sophisticated? Are younger people becoming more sophisticated in navigating the social media information versus older people? Are there, apart from just education and socioeconomic, is there an age differential?
There's actually quite a stark age differential. In the US, the people who are most likely to share misinformation are white men over the age of 65, because they spend on average over 7 hours on Facebook. And part of that is because older audiences, and I put my mum in this category, she's grown up with trusted gatekeepers. She can't imagine that people are manipulating her. Younger generations are so used to manipulation that they have to say #NoFilter to say this hasn't been manipulated. However, they lack the skills to really understand how that's working. So, for example, they spend 5 hours on TikTok. They think they know about the world, but they don't understand the way that the algorithms are manipulating the version of the world that they see. So when we talk about media literacy, we really need multi-generational engagement so that grandma can sit with granddaughter to say, oh, that's interesting, looking at your Instagram. I'm just going to say, I see a lot of low-level misogyny there. Can we talk about that? And then, granddaughter can say, and here's how TikTok works, grandma. So I think ultimately we need ways to bring those two generations together.
Do you think, and this is a question from online, so do you think it's too late to expect significant changes from the social platforms themselves?
We do need to see more from the social platforms. Fundamentally, they need to spend much, much, much more money on content moderation. We see just even in the English language, still lots of misinformation getting through, and it is 10 times worse in Czech and all other sorts of other languages. But one question we have to have as society is, so much of this content is legal speech. So if I have a video of somebody that looks like they're having a vaccine side effect, and I'm Facebook, do I take that down or not? So either as a society, we say Facebook is not a place where you get health information, and we don't have any of it. But ultimately, so much of the actions we see from bad actors, we see less and less over falsehoods. We now see the kind of content that goes right up to the policy guidelines, but doesn't cross it. And that low level pollution is what we as a society need to say, what do we do about that? Because it's freedom of expression issues.
Do we have any questions of people? Flavia? So we have a question from the floor here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. One of the other challenges with social media is the fact that there's it's an echo chamber. So so you didn't touch on that, but it becomes an echo chamber for a person's, like you, as you said, the sort of 65-year-old white males. But it's not just that they get information; they get all information about virtually the whole world. Not just health, but everything else in terms of an echo chamber. That's probably one of the biggest challenges, isn't it? That it's not like you go onto social media and you get an objective assessment of a funny view. It's just that it amplifies your own beliefs.
Yeah, and that is a real challenge, because if you talk to any of the platforms, they'll say, we've run experiments and we try and put the other side into people's feeds, but nobody clicks on it. Because unfortunately, technology sits on the fact that our human nature means that we like to consume information that reinforces our worldview. And in fact, there's new research out this week that says on social media, you actually see more of the other side. But the more you see of the other side, the more you resist that, and you kind of self-choose to spend more time with people like you. So there's kind of mixed bag of research around echo chambers, but you're right, as humans, we choose what we want that confirms our biases, and the platforms feed more of that because they want us to stay online as much as possible.
And there's another question from the floor, and then we might move on to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. That's a fantastic talk. I was just want to ask the question, how we look in the future. So if you look back 10, 20 years ago, many of us wouldn't predict what is happening now. And if we have living prediction knowledge, we might have done things slightly different as a system or community or society. So what do you think about the future? What we can do now to prevent things going down to even worse in the future? You know, such as like a Netflix, they have the TV series, the Death, Love, and the Robots. Some of use this animation to go some extreme of some of these technology problems. So I just want to use your crystal ball to see what's the future. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I don't want to depress everybody, but I'm going to say that, I mean, the evolution of the internet is, without being flippant, like the Gutenberg press, and there was 100 years of war after the Gutenberg press. We're in the process of trying to evolve as societies when you can have access to any information that you want. The answer to this is not quick. It's going to take us 30 to 50 years, I think, to adapt and evolve in this environment. And we can't rely on the platforms. If you look at Facebook, the new metaverse is just repeating all of the problems around harassment, bias, abuse, and harm. So whatever we're doing, the platforms are going to carry on doing it. We're going to have AI, as we're seeing, is causing more and more problems. So the only way we can see our way through this is A, getting our house in order. So how do we adapt and evolve our communication strategies in the context of this? And it's about teaching and literacy, and that's not quick. And it's going to take generations for us to get used to that. But we now have to adapt to how do we do work in a polluted information environment. It's never not going to be polluted. We need to just adapt to that. But it is really the most critical issue of our time because it affects not just health, but climate, democracy, every issue that we're dealing with. Misinformation, unfortunately, is part of that, our new reality.
Thank you. And I'm going to now invite our other panel members. We have Dr. Sandro Demaio online, who is a CEO of Victorian Health Promotion Foundation. I'm going to invite Ariel Bogle, who's a journalist from the ABC, to join us on stage. Sandro is also online. He was unable to attend personally today. So thank you. Welcome, Sandro. Ariel, also welcome. Ariel's a technology reporter with the ABC with a research focus on online culture and extremism. She's won multiple awards and has been extensively nationally, internationally published in major news media. And finally, but not least, Professor Kirsten McCaffery, who's a principal research fellow from the University of Sydney, who has a national and international reputation in shared decision-making, health literacy, and assessment of psychosocial outcomes. So I'm going to also ask, if you have a question, could you please say your name and where you're from, because I'm not sure if Claire can actually see anybody in the room or Sandro, so it will help our panel actually be able to respond to know who they're actually talking to. So at the outset, I'm going to ask each of the panel the question about, is the genie out of the bottle? You've sort of said it is out of the bottle, but what, from your perspective, what do you see that we in the room, we listening as individuals can actually personally do to navigate this system? So I'm going to ask with Sandro first.
Thanks very much. And I'll just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on here in north of Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and any First Nations people in the audience or listening online. And thank you, Claire, for such an incredible presentation. I'm sorry I can't be this morning. I've got a husky throat and I take a very low bar to leaving the house as such. I mean, so is the genie out of the bottle? Yes. Is it the last genie to be let out of the bottle? No. Is the bottle itself even something that's likely to transform and change? Probably. You know, where we're at the moment in Australia with such a fractured media landscape, we're spending more time on devices and consuming more media than ever, making it harder for health messaging to cut through the clutter. And we know that from, you know, the first half of 2022 saw record advertising spend. The Standard Media Index, which reports on reported record advertising agency billings for 2021-22, up 14% to 8.8 billion Australian dollars. And most of that growth was in digital. And social media continues to have, you know, to be a prevalent use, source of news. 31% of Australians use Facebook as their primary source of news, followed by YouTube and Instagram. And no online news publications got within 5% of Facebook. And smartphones are the leading device for news consumption in Australia at 61%, followed by smart TVs or TVs at 23%. So the genie is well and truly out of the bottle. The world has completely changed. And I think us as a health promotion agency, born in 1987 and continuously evolving and innovating, we've been doing a lot of work to be a digital first agency, to co-design and really build the lived experience and voices, the qualitative data into our work be much more strategic about audience segmentation, how we speak on audiences, and even things like handing over our channels at certain points to partners and communities to run and own. But a few learnings, I think, from the last couple of years that we need to take heed of. The first is I think the health community needs to, quite honestly, let go a little and be a bit more humble and empower trusted individuals within the community that we are trying to reach. That was a big lesson of the pandemic, that speaking to communities is not as effective and not as respectful as letting communities effectively speak to themselves, empowering leaders in those communities, their lived experience to be agents of change, but then giving them the resources, the technical resources, the financial resources and the platforms to be able to effectively disseminate those messages. I think really supporting organisations to amplify messages. So yes, we need a trusted voice, but give others resources to share far and wide. So it doesn't replace the role of the clinician or the public health expert or organisations like VicHealth or VicHealth. But it means we do our business a little bit differently, and we see ourselves as kind of an information translator and provider. And if we're not front and centre in the media or necessarily the ones delivering the message, that may actually and probably will go further, faster and deeper into the communities that we're trying to reach. The third would be co-design where possible. And we use that word kind of all over the place, but it's really about handing over power, not just handing over a seat. Don't assume the audience's needs. And I think that's really critical. And finally, really targeted campaigns need accurate data. So we need to continue to base our campaigns on insights and on data. And that can be, quantitative data that we need to be able to, use to inform, including from major media platforms themselves and media providers and those that kind of media monitoring platforms. But it also means qualitative data, as our keynote said, looking at feedback, looking at what works, speaking to communities, and then ultimately designing and implementing the health communication campaigns with communities, not for communities. So they'd be my reflections.
I think that's very important to reflect upon. Ariel, you come to us from a journalistic perspective, and I'm sure that you would have some thoughts that you'd like to contribute.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. I thought it might be helpful just to give a sort of quick overview of what we were seeing from the perspective of ABC. I'm in the science team at ABC, and what we were seeing from the beginning of 2020, just quickly to run through the types of misinformation, disinformation, narratives and tropes we were seeing. So I do remember, I feel like it was February or March 2020, we started to get sent by our audience screenshots of messages that were circulating on WhatsApp and on Facebook Messenger. And you might remember these ones. There was one that claimed traces of the virus had been found at particular train stations in Sydney. And that was also an echo of things to come, because those train stations are associated with suburbs that have quite high populations of Chinese Australians. So that's sort of the racial, what hasn't quite been mentioned yet too, is the kind of the way that racism, xenophobia can play into these narratives as well. That was one of the first things we saw. Then we started seeing posts, rumours spreading also on WhatsApp, Facebook, etc., that were the traces of the virus have been found on the handles of petrol pumps, on fruit, on vegetables. And I kind of put a lot of this in the category of something that Claire also alluded to, this kind of just-in-case sharing. So these aren't people sharing these messages about fruit and petrol handles out of malice. It's more like, this could be happening and I really want to protect my friends and family in an unknown, pretty confusing situation. So I'm just going to forward this on. Don't know how to verify it exactly, but I'm just going to share it just in case. So we're seeing a lot of that at the beginning of 2020. But as things went on, we started to see a lot more of this kind of Some of the things Claire also mentioned, a lot of sharing of preprint research about the virus and how it spread, who might be more susceptible. I do remember there was a lot around, maybe in like mid-2020, a lot about whether particular blood types were associated with catching COVID-19. And that was based on a teeny tiny study, I think done in a Chinese hospital, but quickly spread just because of the accessibility of that kind of research. This is also about the time when we saw, and this is 100% the media's fault, the way that news headlines can be sort of picked up, removed from context and spread. So there was quite a, for us, notorious, I feel like it was Channel 7 headline that said vitamin C can prevent COVID. So, new research says vitamin C can prevent COVID, and people just screenshot that headline, then it just went everywhere so quickly across Facebook, etc. And what we were doing about this time at the ABC is opening up a kind of crowdsourcing project. We invited members of the public to send us in disinformation examples they were seeing. So we got hundreds and hundreds of submissions. It was really quite a fascinating database that we built, and we did a lot of stories off the back of this. But I really want to highlight too, one narrative that came out of this was the way that these disinformation narratives were affecting people's relationships with friends and family and trusted people around them, people in the medical profession, teachers, etc. So a lot of people sent in, say, a screenshot of something their father had sent them. But then they would also write this quite a significant narrative about how they had fought with their father about this, or how they had tried to talk their father around, or it really started to spotlight the way that this kind of misinformation can sort of creep into the cracks of people's relationships, and that also became a big focus for us. So it's sort of touching on some of these similar things, but I think at the beginning, certainly that kind of public health messaging was quite absent. It certainly wasn't part of the discussion, and to be fair, it was a sort of period of confusion, and I mean, even the people in this room, everybody really didn't know at that time exactly how this virus spread. But moving quickly into like 2021, even today, that kind of mixture of politics and health became quickly apparent. So some medicines became an article of faith politically. I think hydroxychloroquine was probably the number one off the back of the kind of Trump interventions there, quickly picked up by certain politicians in Australia, and it became a kind of article of faith of a certain type of perspective on the world, that you believed hydroxychloroquine would be effective against the virus. So that mixture of health and politics, I think, hasn't quite been untangled yet, and probably is one of the most significant challenges we have ahead of us. So I'll leave it there. I've got lots more to say, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
And Kirsten, you're the expert in shared decision-making. So it's become, shared decision-making was sort of a very cool thing to do pre-COVID, and then suddenly we've become incredibly challenged as clinicians trying to do shared decision-making with patients that are coming to us with very different beliefs to what we have to. It can take an hour with a consultation now. So would you like to comment on the whole social media shared decision-making challenges that we're all facing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So my background is shared decision making, and more broadly health literacy, and how you communicate clearly and effectively to people with lower levels of health literacy, which is a staggeringly high proportion of our population, I should say. And also do lots of work in the area of overdiagnosis and overtreatment, and how you communicate that effectively and responsibly. So the pandemic has really challenged us to think about how we communicate so we don't so we don't create confusion, and so we don't fan some of the fires that Claire talked about. Look, I think there are short-term and long-term solutions to this, and I think it's hard as scientists, as we sit in the audience, and it can be quite overwhelming to look at this problem and think, well what do we do about it? In terms of, if we think specifically about shared decision-making, I personally feel it's very important to be transparent about evidence, and in fact, COVID makes it even more important to be transparent and honest about science. But so we can't be accused of concealing information, hiding, lying. I think that is absolutely fundamental. But what we do as individual scientists and researchers in this room, what we do need to do is become advocates of science and build trust in science and take the opportunities that we can, and also learn from there are decades and decades of research and evidence about how we communicate effectively. And what was very clear in the pandemic was that on one side, the public health agencies weren't using any of that science to inform their public communications. Their communications were written for white, university-educated adults. They weren't written for people who had left school at 16, who had interrupted education, or whose first language wasn't English. And we absolutely saw, when we looked at people's knowledge and understanding, attitudes and intentions for vaccination, that those people with lower education, from non-English speaking backgrounds, from different age groups who didn't watch the ABC, had lower levels of knowledge, were less perceived the virus as less serious, were less likely to follow social distancing and restrictions. We absolutely saw that whole. So what we need to do is make sure our agencies are following the best science, number one. But two, of course, we've got to engage with this whole new world of social media. And in terms of coming back to your question of shared decision-making, I think it's even more important than it was before, because shared decision-making is about understanding where people sit in terms of their knowledge of the evidence. It's giving them the evidence and the skills to understand the information. It's understanding their perspectives, it's empathizing with their perspectives and enabling them to make an informed choice. And I would argue that shouldn't only happen in a consultation room. This should be happening from school. It should be happening in the media. We need a kind of multi-pronged approach to build the skills in the community to be able to engage in shared decision-making.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? A bit bedazzled by the lights here. Yes, two up the back there, please.
Thanks very much. I'm curious what you think about approaching it by teaching children, because I think a lot of the anti-smoking and all that happened much more effectively when children took the message home to their parents.
Can I respond to that one? There's actually a wonderful trial done by Andy Oxman and a European and North American team where they taught Ugandan primary school kids how to make informed decisions about tests and treatments, and they had a wonderful curriculum which was embedded into primary school classes, which had cartoons and videos. And they conducted a beautiful randomized trial published in Nature, and it was very, very effective. They're now trying to make that program online and disseminate it, but there's great evidence that we can do it. It just needs to be rolled out more widely, these kinds of interventions, so yes.
And again, if you can just state your name, and if you're directing the question to a particular panel member, say their name too. I think there's another question here.
Hi, I'm Andrew Wilkes. I'm in the innovation and drug discovery area, so all this has been rather harrowing for me this last hour. It's not the problem here that we humans are just a bit rubbish, that we are callow, credulous, just a bit dim, and are these not the buttons that the black hats are pushing on to sort of get their message across? And is there not a more subversive way that we can fight against that sort of misinformation and disinformation? Are we being too nice? Are we playing this too much with a straight bat?
I might ask Claire to start with that, and then Sandro, perhaps.
Yes, thank you, fellow Brit, for using the word rubbish. Yes, it absolutely is the case that our human brains are just not very good at making sense of information. And to your point, actually, we are seeing really good research now on what's called inoculation theory, which is when you teach people how our brains are being manipulated and you say, here are the tactics that are being used against you. So if you get a WhatsApp message that says, my sister's a nurse, what she's hearing, ... our brains are very much drawn to first-person narratives, and so we're less likely to be critical. And so we just did did some research in Kenya with a 5-day SMS course where we were training people on like short SMS things. And the experimental trial showed that it was effective when you teach people how their emotions are being manipulated, as well as the specific tactics and techniques. So I think to your point, I don't think that we should be, I think there's this idea that we should be using the same dark tactics that the Black Cat operas are doing. What we should recognize is the other side understands emotion. They understand human psychology much better actually than we do. And I think if we were better at that and we taught each other how we are vulnerable and how our brains are more likely to believe this stuff, there is increasing research that shows that is effective.
Sandro, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I echo largely what Claire said. So, I mean, here in Victoria, we are investing in a lot of work around really bringing to light for various stakeholders the pervasive and predatory behaviours of industry and how they prey on our biology, and particularly that of children. So our latest Quit campaign that was launched this week is the first time we've ever launched a major social marketing campaign on tobacco that focuses on the industry and what they're doing to us to push these products on us rather than the product itself. We will continue, obviously, to inform consumers about a product that kills 1 in 2 to 1 in 3 of its regular users, but we're also now increasingly shining a light on the industry itself. We're funding a Lancet series on the commercial determinants because we know that the science community needs to build its literacy and a shared understanding and norms around what these tactics are and how they influence everything from our economic models through to our biology and our individual preferences. We're working on really trying to upskill policymakers in their understanding around digital marketing and things like dark marketing and how they actually work. But we're also rolling out a program with young teenagers across the state where we're actually using a citizen science approach and looking at how these platforms work. And the kind of light bulb moment when you have 150 teenagers in a room learning how the algorithms work, they're aware that they exist, but they don't actually understand fully. And so I absolutely think that we need to kind of be, the gloves need to come off. We need to be far more aggressive and in certain cases, use, I think much more urgent, I'm careful of the words that I use, but, much more urgent in our approaches, including agencies like ours, because at the moment we're bringing a bow and arrow to a nuclear war, and we need to realise that, and there will be no single silver bullet. We do still need to upskill ourselves and clinicians. I think we need to look at the remuneration models for young scientists so that they're actually valued when they're doing science translation. We've launched a translational research fellowship program that actually aims to put scientists into the policy and communication space as part of their postdoctoral training pathways. We need to see more of this, but we also need to go much harder and be much more I think assertive, if not aggressive, on the behaviours of industry and how they are manipulating our brains and our biology, which they are.
That sort of segues nicely into an online question. And I think it's an important question because we are an organisation of people with an incredible breadth and depth of knowledge. So what should organisations like the Academy do to help rather than hinder? And is this perhaps even an opportunity for an organisation like the Academy to have a very positive effect in society? So maybe Ariel first.
So I just want to quickly piggyback on that last question too, if I may. I just feel it's important to not overstate also the impact of these kinds of online communities and narratives. If you look at the outcomes in Australia, we have had a very successful vaccine rollout. We can certainly debate what is happening now with the COVID-19 response, but if compared to other countries, I mean, arguably we have done pretty okay. And I think it's important that these narratives and online communities will always exist. There's no public health messaging that's going to reason them out of it so that everybody in Australia walks in lockstep on these types of issues. So I think it's important too, as Claire and Sandro also alluding to shore up the kind of broader ecosystem of trust and accountability, and that is being open about the way that big industry manipulates populations. It's also being accountable about when science is wrong, and being open about that. It's also about government being accountable and open. And it was interesting also to see earlier this year, I was a part of a reporting team around the federal election, looking at some of these sort of like hidden campaigns going on online around the election. There was a large push to have some anti-vaccine candidates stand and succeed. You know, the United Australia Party ran a candidate in every seat, as did One Nation, and they failed spectacularly, probably for a variety of reasons. But we should sort of take heart from that, but not rest on the laurels, I think, because we really need to shore up the broader sort of trust and accountability that the communities can have, and that starts from kids onwards. So I'll just state that too. We're never going to get everyone to agree. Full
So
stop.
where do you think the Academy can contribute to this space in a positive manner?
Yeah, I was thinking the other day, I mean, I also spent a lot of time on TikTok for my sins, and I'm starting to see a lot of narratives around the birth control pill. This is probably a bit of a left field issue, but a lot of young women are starting to discuss the pill, who got them to start taking it, what the side effects may be, and there is a sort of a growing kind of misinformation, conspiracy theory ecosystem growing around the pill and the kind of side effects it may have for young women. But it is true that you kind of just get prescribed this thing when you're in your mid-teens, and your doctor probably doesn't quite step you through all the options. We can see that by the kind of rates of prescriptions of various forms of birth control in Australia. There's a preponderance of pill prescription compared to other options, etc. It started to make me think about this kind of what institutions like this can do to sort of start having those conversations younger. We were talking about shared decision making and starting much younger, and I sort of think focusing from the start there in helping people, even just on that one-on-one sort of GP visit, the broader discussion about the kind of health choices that Australians are making for themselves pretty routinely. I think the focus should start there.
Kirsten?
Well, yes, as an academy, I think it would be nice to know, and I'm looking at Catherine and Ingrid here, whether we have a community engagement strategy. We write reports for policymakers and politicians, and do we do a sort of similar kind of, do we have something similar that we could do for the community and have, and deliberately try to get expertise in social media and choose key topics that we could then put onto social media and have a presence there and build our credibility and our brand, I guess, as a place of evidence and science within the community, not just within our, professional area. So I think that's something we can do, and I think as individual scientists within our institutions and our places of work, we need to advocate for resources and attention to this area, because, we're not skilled in social media, communication. We can partner with people who are, we can work with our postdocs and PhD students who are much more familiar with this space than many of us are. And we can learn from the science. We've heard a lot about storytelling, and there's a great science about using narratives, and we can get more comfortable as scientists using narratives when we communicate and try and communicate to the public. So look, I think in short, I think there is a lot the academy can do, and there's a lot as individuals we can also do working through our institutions and other societies and organisations.
Claire, sort of rephrasing the question for you, this is a really relatively young organisation compared to our American equivalent of the Academy. So we're 8 years old, correct? And so how impactful would our, dare I say, sister organisation in America be seen in this space in America? Do you think this is an opportunity for the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences to actually have an impact in the community?
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity. And I have to say that I have been part of some of the conversations with the American counterpart. And in the US, where, of course, polarization is a much bigger issue and many institutions, including news media, are politicized, they are actually very much in the middle of so many different conversations and still very highly trusted. I think that there has been a challenge of like, where do you even start? And I'll just say this, like, training isn't seen as sexy. But I think actually there's so much you can do as an association to help listen to your members about where do they feel like there's skills gaps and provide some of that training. And, even Ariel just talked about being aware of some of these like emerging issues, like we call them data deficits, when people are confused about issues. I think there's something there, which means if you're ahead of those, you can do briefings for your members to help be on the front foot of some of these things. So I think again, so much of misinformation, we end up playing whack-a-mole afterwards. And actually, we should be much better at being on the front foot and being proactive about some of these things. So I think there's huge opportunities. And I think because of your size, you could do some really innovative things that actually your American counterpart could then learn from.
We have a question back here. And again, state your name, please.
Yeah, Fran Baum from University of Adelaide. Claire, thank you for your fantastic keynote address. It was really brilliant. But I want to ask Sandro and Claire, have you had any backlash to the work that you do? Because Sandro, it's quite brave. You're taking on industry. And I suspect there might be. So if you could just both talk to that, thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Absolutely. And in fact, most of the time I take it as a prize of honour. I remember the first time that I had a phone call from Coca-Cola when I was at Harvard, and they pretended to be a family member to get through to my office to offer me a job. I've also had them visit the Parliament in Canberra the day before I arrived as a WHO technical advisor, and visit pretty much every MP I visited 24 hours before I did. And it didn't click until I noticed the 5th bottle of Coca-Cola on the MP's table in their private offices, asked them where on earth that came from. And they were like, oh, yeah, small world, Coca-Cola was here yesterday. There are countless other examples. I do get death threats. I get, threats of, fairly crazy things, accusing me of all sorts of stuff. The noose is coming, the Nuremberg is coming. I think, there are kind of two distinct groups. There's the industry that is going to, that is very powerful, that has a stronghold on government and on, many parts of significant power in society. They're never going to like, when you become effective. And I think, Fran, you're a world leader, and I don't, you taught me a lot of this. And I think you have to take it as a badge of honor that when you're starting to become effective at creating change and noise, you will see, industry start to push back and push back in ways that are often quite personal. What has been probably a more strange phenomenon is the last couple of years of the rise of just these, quite vicious personal attacks on social media. And, I remember even 10 years ago on my column in The Conversation, probably half of it, I remember writing a piece about obesity policy, and half the comments were calling me a left-wing nutbag, and half the audience was calling me a right-wing lunatic. And I decided that at that point I'd probably just ignore them and try not to, learn from it in ways that I can. And I do use the feedback and I've used that to shape and refine my arguments so that I know where the kind of catch points will be. There are certain words that really infuriate people. Words like policy, which are benign to me, but people hate the word policy. So I talk about government action instead. There are things like that which I've tweaked and changed based on those insights. But I think you have to ignore most of it, take some of it as a compliment, and then learn from what you can.
Thank you. Claire?
Yeah, that was partly the slide I talked about harassment. If you do this work, you get harassed. And I have to say, I am a woman, and so we get it worse than men. Women of colour get it worse than me. But yeah, my inbox is not a pretty sight. My Twitter feed is often not a pretty sight. I'm sure Ariel gets the same thing. The platforms are not being aggressive enough, I don't think, about, trying to prevent this. And I'll be honest, it does have a chilling effect on speech. And I say a lot less now than I used to, because it just took a toll over time. And I'm much more aware now of what I say, where I say it, how it's going to get clipped and used. And it's just a reality of it. But it's hugely concerning, and it's just getting worse, and the platforms are just putting their heads in the sand, and they're allowing this harassment and abuse to happen. And it is like I said, there were many doctors and nurses online, and many of them have just said, I can't do it anymore. There's been a huge toll during the pandemic, so it is a real problem.
Thank you. Just occurred to me, I'm going to take a quick straw poll in the room. Put your hand up if you believe some presentation you've given or something you've written or something online that someone's actually taken a quote from you or taken a snapshot and used it as disinformation in some other space, because I certainly have. Have you? So about half the people might have had this experience, because it is quite worrying that we have to be careful what we're going to say, because someone's going to actually use it almost to tell another story. We've got a couple more, one here, one there, and then we're going to get close to having to stop, I think.
Thank you, Sharon Friel from the Australian National University. Just an amazing panel discussion. That was awesome. Well, a recommendation for the Academy: why on earth could we not have a TikTok like the 3 nurses that Claire showed us? Why can't we have 3 fellows? I'm practicing my dance. But maybe a much more serious point, perhaps. So we've got a very live discussion in Australia about the establishment of a CDC. And so a CDC, an authoritative voice, an authoritative agency around many of the issues that you've all just spoken about. And so there's a real opportunity for the CDC, if all of that goes ahead, to be really creative, do it differently, shake it up, learn from some of the mistakes that the CDC in the US made during COVID. So what would be the recommendation? Well, one, who should be the CEO? I don't mean the person's name, but imagine if we had a communications person as the CEO of the new CDC. But what would be your recommendations, your 1 or 2 recommendations in the context of the issues we're speaking about on this panel? What should the CDC do to really get ahead of the curve in the way, and I suppose particularly in the way that you were speaking about, Claire?
Can I just, because we've got a couple more questions, can we just keep the answers really brief? Claire, do you want a 1-sentence answer?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think it's a great idea, because I think if you just read the report that the CDC did about its failings, it basically said we screwed up with communication. I think there is an absolutely amazing opportunity to do it right this time.
And I think to balance the debate, I think this is an important question. We've been talking about industry, but will you also, this is I guess to Sandro, be messaging about biotech and pharma research bringing new drugs and vaccines that make a huge benefit to people? I mean, there's always a balance of industry, the dark and the light side of industry.
Yeah,
Comment?
absolutely. So the Lancet series that we've supported, that will be hopefully out later this year, early next year, on the commercial determinants, really does try to take a more nuanced approach. That, when we talk about the private sector, we're talking about smallholder farmers that feed most of the planet. It's not just the multinational corporations, and there are big parts of the private sector that are actually fully aligned with a healthy, prosperous planet and population. And I think that's a good example that's been raised.
And one last question at the back. And again, we'll have brief answers because I'm cognizant of the time.
Thanks, Ingrid Schäfer, Melbourne. A comment and a question. I think this has been a brilliant session about misinformation, wonderful keynote. I think it does highlight the disparity, which is generational, and I doubt very few of the fellows are on Twitter and on all these social media, and people, when I tell them on it, they look aghast at me, my colleagues. And I think it'd be great if the Academy did do something to upskill us and to show us that this is important and we have to communicate with the rest of the world, not just with ourselves. The question, I've worked I look after children with very severe epilepsy, and I've worked with families for far too long and have been very involved in community engagement. And it's really fantastic. We've got this set of families that have now run 6 annual conferences about gene therapies for their very, very sick kids. But the problem that I see is between the communities, in that you have your bright community of parents and you have your normal community of parents. As a physician, I talk about the normal community, and they don't even know what the bright community is thinking about. So how do we bring these communities together so that they can talk to each other, so that the normal folk understand the bright folk? I hope I haven't said that in too politically incorrect way.
Again, if each person give us a brief answer so you can all comment, please.
Yeah, that's a great point. What we do is we listen to the people who are articulate and who speak up, and they tend to be the bright parents or patients, and they're organising and they're very good at being advocates. What we need to do is make all health organisations aware of the issue of equity. And have equity policies in their structures, so that those kinds of organisations, patient organisations, are able to bring in those other voices and those all sorts of consumer organisations that we can encourage to hear different voices, and those can be voices from people with disabilities, from people from different culturally and linguistic backgrounds. I think the advantage of COVID is that it has raised awareness of the diversity in our community and the need to hear and listen to diverse voices.
Ariel?
I'm not sure I have the expertise to speak on that one, so not something I've had experience with per se, but I just quickly say on the social media, encouraging scientists, health practitioners to be on social media, just quickly say two things from my experience in media is I absolutely encourage it. The space cannot be ceded just to voices of disinformation, etc., but it is a space where you are beholden to a giant technology company with its own priorities. And so it's vital still to maintain those kind of community avenues of discussion and not just be relying on social media, because they can pull the rug out from you at any time. So I would definitely quickly say that. And secondly, while I absolutely think it's vital for these voices of scientists and medical practitioners to be on social media, I will also just briefly allude to the fact that a lot of people did get on social media and provide a lot of really useful, important information about COVID. But there is this kind of thing we might call like Twitter brain, where once you begin and you get a lot of interaction, you want more, you sort of get addicted to it. I've certainly fallen victim to this myself, but you begin to commentate on everything. And so I just would flag that as a potential risk, because in some cases during the pandemic, I think people sometimes got ahead of themselves, ahead of the research, decided to speak out, and it actually, because the news media quickly picked up on it, put those people on the news, or grabbed that tweet and put it, just like embedded it in an article with no extra reporting around it, it actually ended up confusing the situation in many cases. So encouragement with a note of caution.
Thank you. Sandro, last comments on that?
Yeah, very quickly. So I think to Prof. Scheffer's work, and just want to acknowledge her important work, I think you absolutely can bridge those divides, but you need to set out to do it, and do it in a way that's sort of, well thought out, respectful and strategic. So you need to have a strategy that sits behind it, that needs to be probably informed by lived experience and co-designed with community. But certainly, it's something we're working on and learning from many mistakes along the way at VicHealth. In terms of the roles, I think there is a strong role for the Academy to provide essential skills and resources to lower the bar for entry, to provide, some buffers around some of the risks. And I think it's a great role for the Academy to have. I think for scientists, it just comes down to practice. When I reflect on my own journey, and don't necessarily dive into TikTok as a starting point, even just starting to think about translating your scientific work into an op-ed or into something that is reaching a broader audience, creating content that then sits on another platform, can be read by an audience of, teenagers rather than necessarily world-leading scientists. That starts to kind of challenge the way you communicate your work, think about it. It polishes you as a scientist and as a communicator, I think. And finally, as a funder, which we are, I think we also need to think about our role. How do we make sure that in the remuneration model, that in the value model for scientists, that we build space, that advocacy isn't a dirty word, that it's not sort of a side gig you have to do in your spare time, but actually we value it in fellowships, in science funding, and in pathways for clinicians.
Thank you. And Claire?
Yeah, just very quickly, as you can imagine in the US, which is so polarized, we're constantly trying to find spaces where different types of people are together. And that's churches, that's sports fandom, that's dog parks. It's places that actually people mix with many different people. And I think to all the things that Sandro have said is that, and even workplaces, large workplaces are where people are still mixing with those people that they wouldn't choose to otherwise. So there are, I think, real opportunities for us to get into those spaces as opposed to going to communities that already exist and think the same. We need to think about those spaces where people are mixing.
Thank you. So I'd like you all to join with me in thanking our keynote, Claire Wardle, and our wonderful panel. I think this is a topic we could talk about for hours, and it's certainly hopefully given us all some provocative thinking. Thank you.